Princess Elena of Valdoria had always known that love would be a luxury she couldn't afford. At 26, she carried herself with the practiced grace of someone born to rule, her dark hair always perfectly styled, her emerald eyes reflecting both warmth and the weight of expectation. The small European kingdom of Valdoria depended on strategic marriages to maintain its independence, and Elena understood her duty better than most. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Castle Valdoria as Elena reviewed potential suitors with her mother, Queen Isabella. Each photograph represented a political alliance, a trade agreement, or military protection. Prince Marcus of Astoria brought naval strength. Duke Ferdinand of Corvina offered mining rights. Count Alessandro of Meridia promised cultural exchanges that could boost tourism. Your father and I'm married for duty, Queen Isabella said, her voice gentle but firm. Love came later, as it often does in royal marriages. You must think of the kingdom first, Elena. Your personal happiness is secondary to Valdoria's survival. Elena nodded, though something inside her rebelled against the cold calculation of it all. She had watched her parents' marriage evolve from formal courtesy to genuine affection, but she wondered if she would be so fortunate. The thought of spending her life with a stranger, sharing intimate moments with someone chosen by politics rather than her heart, made her feel hollow inside. That afternoon, Elena escaped to the royal gardens, seeking solace among the rose bushes her grandmother had planted decades ago. The gardens were her sanctuary, the one place where she could shed the weight of royal protocol and simply breathe. She was examining a particularly beautiful white rose when she heard unfamiliar voices approaching. The irrigation system needs complete replacement, a deep voice was saying. These historical gardens require specialized care, and the current setup is actually damaging some of the heritage plantings. Elena looked up to see two men in work clothes examining the fountain at the garden center. One was elderly with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of decades working with soil and plants. The other was younger, perhaps 30, with sun-streaked brown hair and eyes the color of rich earth. He moved with quiet confidence, his attention completely focused on the intricate garden design. Your Highness! The elderly man noticed her first, immediately removing his cap and bowing awkwardly. Forgive us. We didn't realize you were here. Please, don't apologize, Elena said, approaching them. I love seeing people who appreciate these gardens. You mentioned irrigation problems. The younger man looked up then, and Elena felt something shift in her chest. His gaze was direct and honest, unmarked by the calculated deference she was accustomed to from courtiers. For a moment, he seemed to forget who she was, his eyes lighting up with enthusiasm for his work. The system was installed 50 years ago, he explained, his voice warm and animated. It's flooding the heritage roses and starving the Mediterranean herbs. With some adjustments and new drought-resistant native plantings, we could create something that honors the garden's history while ensuring its future. This is James Mitchell, the elderly man interjected, remembering protocol. He's the landscape consultant we hired. I'm Robert Chun, the head gardener. James, Elena repeated, testing the name. It felt refreshingly simple after a lifetime of titles and formal addresses. You speak about the garden like it's alive. James smiled, and Elena noticed how it transformed his entire face. Isn't it? Every garden tells a story about the people who created it, the hands that tended it, the moments of joy and sorrow it witnessed. This place has seen over 2 centuries of your family's history. Elena found herself drawn into conversation about soil composition and heritage seed varieties, topics she had never imagined could be so fascinating. James spoke with passion about preserving the garden's character while adapting it for climate change. He showed her subtle signs of plant stress she had never noticed, explaining how small changes could restore the garden to its former glory. You really see things differently, Elena observed as they walked past the ornamental pond where she had played as a child. I suppose I do, James said. Most people see a pretty picture. I see a living ecosystem with needs and relationships. Every plant depends on others for survival, just like people. As the afternoon wore on, Elena forgot about royal duties and political marriages. She found herself laughing at James's stories about stubborn olive trees and temperamental orchids. He treated her not as a princess, but as someone genuinely interested in learning about the natural world. When he accidentally got soil on his hands and absently wiped it on his shirt, she fought the urge to find it charming. "Your Highness," Robert eventually interrupted, "we should probably return to our work." Reality crashed back over Elena like cold water. She was Princess Elena of Valdoria, not a woman who could spend leisurely afternoons discussing gardening with attractive consultants. Her mother would be expecting her for the evening diplomatic reception, where she would smile politely at potential suitors and pretend to care about their hunting expeditions and yacht collections. "Of course," she said, forcing her voice back into its formal register. "Thank you for explaining the garden's needs. I'll ensure you have whatever resources are required for the restoration." As she walked back toward the castle, Elena felt James watching her go. She wanted to turn back, to continue their conversation, to ask him about his life beyond gardening. Instead, she squared her shoulders and returned to the world of duty and expectation that awaited her. That evening, as she smiled graciously at Duke Ferdinand's stories about his mineral collections, Elena's mind wandered to soil compositions and heritage roses. She caught herself wondering what James thought about during quiet moments, whether he had family, what dreams kept him awake at night. The questions felt dangerous and thrilling in equal measure. Queen Isabella noticed her distraction during dinner. "You seem preoccupied, dear. The Duke was quite taken with you." He mentioned possibility of announcing an engagement before the autumn festival. Elena's heart sank. Duke Ferdinand was perfectly acceptable by royal standards. Wealthy, well-connected, appropriately titled. He was also boring, pompous, and had shown no interest in anything Elena actually cared about. The thought of spending her life listening to him discuss mining rights made her feel trapped. "Mother, I need more time," Elena said carefully. "Such an important decision shouldn't be rushed." "Time is a luxury we don't have," Queen Isabella replied. "King Frederick is growing stronger, and his territorial ambitions are well known. We need allies, Elena. Strong ones." That night, Elena stood on her balcony overlooking the gardens, the moonlight casting silver shadows across the paths she had walked that afternoon. Somewhere out there, James was probably in his modest accommodations, perhaps reading about botanical conservation or sketching improvement plans for the garden. The simplicity of such a life seemed impossibly appealing. She thought about his hands, capable and unafraid of honest work. She remembered how his eyes had lit up when discussing the garden's potential, the genuine care in his voice when he spoke about preserving its legacy. In a world full of people who wanted things from her, political alliances, social status, financial gain, James had simply shared his passion for creating beautiful, sustainable spaces. Elena had always accepted that duty would define her life. She had prepared herself to marry for politics, to supplement her personal desires for the greater good of Valdoria. But one afternoon in the gardens had awakened something she hadn't known was sleeping. The longing for genuine connection, for someone who saw her as more than a political asset. As she finally turned to go inside, Elena caught a glimpse of movement in the garden below. A figure was walking slowly among the rose bushes, stopping occasionally to examine plants by moonlight. Even from a distance, she recognized James's thoughtful, careful movements. He loved the garden enough to study it in his own time, to understand its needs beyond his professional obligations. Elena pressed her hand against the cool glass of her balcony door, feeling an ache she couldn't quite name. Tomorrow would bring more meetings about suitable marriages, more discussions of alliances and strategic advantages. But tonight, she allowed herself to imagine a different life, one where love and duty could somehow coexist. The next few days passed in a blur of royal obligations. Elena attended state dinners, reviewed trade proposals, and endured increasingly pointed conversations about her marital future. Each potential suitor seemed indistinguishable from the last, well-bred, well-connected, and utterly uninteresting. She found herself making excuses to walk past the garden windows, hoping to catch glimpses of James at work. She learned his routines without meaning to. He arrived each morning just as the sun reached the eastern wall, carrying coffee in a thermos that had seen better days. He worked methodically but with obvious affection, treating each plant like something precious. During his lunch breaks, he would sit on the old stone bench near the herb garden, often sketching or reading books about sustainable horticulture. Elena began timing her own walks to coincide with his presence in the garden. She told herself it was mere curiosity about the restoration project, but her heart raced each time she saw him. Their interactions remained brief and formal. She was the princess, he was the consultant, but Elena treasured each exchange about plant varieties and garden history. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday morning. Elena was reviewing diplomatic correspondence when she heard raised voices from the garden courtyard below. Looking out, she saw James in what appeared to be a heated discussion with Lord Pemberton, the castle's officious steward. "This is highly irregular," Lord Pemberton was saying, his voice carrying clearly through the rain. "Her Royal Highness has not authorized these changes to the original plans." "The original plans will kill half the heritage plantings," James replied, his usual calm cracking slightly. "I'm trying to save a garden that's been here for over 2 centuries, not destroy it for the sake of bureaucratic convenience." "You forget yourself, Mr. Mitchell. This is not your garden to save." Elena watched James's jaw tighten. Even from her window, she could see the frustration in his posture, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. Lord Pemberton represented everything she disliked about court life: rigid adherence to protocol over common sense, power wielded without wisdom. Without thinking, Elena grabbed an umbrella and headed for the garden. She found the 2 men still arguing near the fountain, both thoroughly soaked despite the morning drizzle. "Lord Pemberton," she said, her voice carrying the authority she had learned from years of royal training. "Is there some problem with the garden restoration?" "Your Highness," Lord Pemberton bowed stiffly. "Mr. Mitchell has taken liberties with the approved plans. I was explaining proper protocol." Elena looked at James, noting the way his eyes flashed with suppressed anger. "What sort of liberties?" "He's proposing to relocate some of the heritage roses," Lord Pemberton said, as if describing a crime against nature, "without proper authorization. To save them," James interjected, then caught himself addressing the princess directly. "Your Highness, the roses are dying in their current location. The soil drainage is wrong, and they're getting too much direct sun. Moving them 20 feet east would give them the conditions they need to thrive." Elena found herself caught between protocol and common sense. Lord Pemberton represented the establishment that had shaped her entire life, the careful rules and procedures that maintained royal dignity. James represented something else entirely: expertise, passion, and a genuine desire to create rather than merely preserve appearances. "Show me," she said finally. The next hour changed everything for Princess Elena. As James guided her through the garden, explaining soil conditions and plant relationships with the patience of a born teacher, she felt more engaged than she had in years of diplomatic meetings. He showed her the subtle signs of distress in the heritage roses: yellowing leaves, stunted growth, the way they leaned desperately toward better conditions. These varieties have survived wars, droughts, and countless royal celebrations, James explained, kneeling beside a struggling bush that Elena's great-grandmother had planted. "But they can't survive being ignored. Plants are honest. They show you exactly what they need if you know how to listen." Lord Pemberton huffed disapproval from several paces away, but Elena found herself kneeling in the damp earth beside James, studying the plant's root system. Her expensive dress was getting muddy. Her carefully styled hair was coming loose in the rain, and she couldn't remember feeling more alive. "What does this one need?" she asked, touching a yellowed leaf gently. Better drainage, morning sun instead of afternoon heat, and companions that won't compete for nutrients, James said, his voice growing warm with enthusiasm. If we move her over there, next to the lavender and rosemary, she'll be protected from the harsh afternoon light, but still get the morning warmth she craves. Elena looked where he pointed, trying to see the garden through his eyes. Slowly, the seemingly random arrangement of plants began to make sense as an interconnected community, each species supporting the others. You see gardens the way I've been taught to see kingdoms, she realized aloud. Everything connected, each part affecting the whole. James met her eyes, and, for a moment, the careful distance between princess and consultant disappeared entirely. I suppose that's true. Both require understanding what each element needs to thrive and how to balance competing interests for the greater good. The parallel was so obvious once spoken that Elena wondered why she had never seen it before. She had spent her life learning about political alliances and economic partnerships, but she had never considered how those same principles might apply to the natural world. Your Highness, Lord Pemberton interrupted sharply. You're getting quite muddy. Perhaps we should continue this inspection from the covered walkway. Elena looked down at her silk dress, now decorated with soil stains and water spots. Instead of the horrified embarrassment she expected to feel, she found herself fighting a smile. When was the last time she had gotten dirty? When had she last forgotten about appearances long enough to kneel in the earth? The roses can't be properly evaluated from a distance, she said, surprising herself with her firmness. James, please show me the rest of your concerns. They spent the morning walking through every section of the garden, James explaining his restoration plans while Elena asked increasingly sophisticated questions about plant biology and ecosystem balance. Lord Pemberton followed at a disapproving distance, occasionally clearing his throat when Elena's questions became too animated or when she forgot to maintain proper royal posture. By the time they returned to the castle, Elena was thoroughly soaked, completely disheveled, and more intellectually stimulated than she had been in months. She felt as if she had discovered a secret language that revealed hidden layers of meaning in the world around her. Thank you for the education, she told James formally, though her eyes conveyed deeper gratitude. Please proceed with your recommendations for the heritage roses. I'll ensure Lord Pemberton has the proper authorizations. Your Highness, James said with a slight bow, but his voice held warmth that protocol couldn't quite contain. It was my pleasure to share the garden with someone who truly wanted to understand it. As Elena walked back to the castle, she was acutely aware of Lord Pemberton's disapproving silence. She knew she would face questions about her conduct, lectures about proper royal behavior, and probably a conversation with her mother about maintaining appropriate distance from the staff. Sure enough, Queen Isabella was waiting in Elena's private sitting room when she returned, her expression carefully neutral in a way that suggested strong feelings held under tight control. Elena, dear, her mother said, taking in the mud-stained dress and windswept hair. Lord Pemberton has expressed some concerns about your morning activities. Elena had expected this conversation, but she felt surprisingly calm about it. I was reviewing the garden restoration project. It's a significant investment, and I wanted to understand what we're funding. Kneeling in the dirt with a consultant is hardly a royal review of palace improvements, Queen Isabella said gently. Darling, I know you're feeling pressure about marriage, but acting out isn't going to change the reality of your situation. Acting out, Elena repeated, stung by the characterization. I was learning about horticulture and heritage preservation. Since when is education considered inappropriate behavior for a future queen? Queen Isabella sighed, settling into the chair across from Elena's window seat. It's not the learning that concerns me, dear. It's the way Lord Pemberton described your enthusiasm for the young man's company. Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she forced her voice to remain steady. James Mitchell is an expert in his field. His knowledge could help us preserve an important part of Aldoria's cultural heritage. I fail to see how taking his expertise seriously constitutes inappropriate behavior. Elena, her mother said more gently, you're an intelligent woman, and I'm not blind to your feelings. But whatever attraction you might feel toward this man, it cannot lead anywhere. You know that, don't you? The quiet question hit Elena like a physical blow. She had been trying not to examine her feelings too closely, telling herself that her interest in James was purely intellectual. But her mother's gentle concern forced her to confront the truth she had been avoiding. She was attracted to James Mitchell. More than attracted, she was developing feelings that went far beyond professional respect or physical appeal. She was drawn to his intelligence, his passion for his work, his ability to see beauty and potential in overlooked places. She enjoyed his company in a way that made every other interaction feel hollow by comparison. I understand my duty, Elena said quietly, not quite answering her mother's question. Do you? Queen Isabella studied her daughter's face carefully. Because Duke Ferdinand has formally requested permission to court you. He's offering very generous terms, military protection, mining partnerships, and a substantial dowry contribution to our national treasury. Your father and I are inclined to accept. Elena felt the walls of her predetermined future closing in around her. Duke Ferdinand was exactly the sort of match her family had always planned for her. Politically advantageous, financially beneficial, socially appropriate. He was also utterly lacking in anything that might inspire love or even deep respect. How much time do I have? Elena asked. He would like an answer by the autumn festival. That gives you 6 weeks to prepare yourself for the engagement announcement. 6 weeks. Elena stared out her window at the garden below, where she could see James working near the fountain. 6 weeks to enjoy stolen conversations about soil composition and heritage plants. 6 weeks before she committed herself to a lifetime of Duke Ferdinand's mining anecdotes and hunting stories. That evening, Elena attended a state dinner with visiting dignitaries from neighboring kingdoms. She smiled and made polite conversation, played her role as the charming princess who would someday make an advantageous marriage. But her mind kept wandering to the garden, to James's explanation of how plants adapted to challenging conditions. Duke Ferdinand was particularly attentive during dinner, describing his latest acquisition of a copper mine in exhaustive detail. Elena nodded at appropriate intervals while privately wondering if he had ever noticed a flower, much less understood what it needed to thrive. Princess Elena seems distracted this evening, observed Count Alessandro during the reception afterward. Perhaps the weight of impending decisions? Elena realized she had been staring out the window toward the gardens instead of listening to the conversation about trade tariffs. Forgive me, she said with practiced grace. I've been preoccupied with a heritage preservation project. How wonderfully domestic, Duke Ferdinand said with patronizing approval. It's charming when ladies take interest in gardens and decoration. Of course, once we're married, you'll have much more important concerns to occupy your time. The casual assumption that her interests were merely decorative hobbies that would be set aside for more serious matters made Elena's chest tighten with anger. She forced a polite smile while imagining how James would respond to having his life's work dismissed as feminine decoration. Actually, she said carefully, heritage preservation is quite complex. It requires understanding of botany, ecology, soil science, climate adaptation, and historical research. Rather like managing a kingdom, really, balancing competing needs for the health of the whole system. Duke Ferdinand blinked in confusion, clearly not expecting such a detailed response about gardening. Well, yes, I suppose. Though hardly comparable to real governance, of course. Elena excused herself shortly afterward, claiming fatigue. But instead of going to her rooms, she found herself walking through the castle corridors toward the garden terraces. The evening air was cool and sweet with the scent of jasmine, and moonlight cast long shadows across the carefully tended beds. She wasn't surprised to find James still working, though it was well past normal hours. He was adjusting irrigation lines near the herb garden, his movements careful and precise in the dim light. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked softly, not wanting to startle him. James looked up, and she saw surprise and something else, pleasure, cross his features. Your Highness, I didn't expect to see you out here so late. Neither did I, Elena admitted. I was at a dinner with visiting dignitaries, and I found myself thinking about the garden instead of listening to their conversation. That seems like poor diplomatic strategy, James said with a slight smile. Elena surprised herself by laughing. Probably, but they were discussing mining rights and trade agreements, and I kept wondering whether you had managed to fix the drainage problem near the rose bushes. I did, actually. James gestured toward the area they had examined that morning. The water should flow properly now, away from the root systems. By next spring, those roses should be thriving again. There was satisfaction in his voice, the quiet pride of someone who had solved a complex problem through skill and patience. Elena found herself envying that sense of concrete accomplishment. When had she last created something beautiful or solved a problem that mattered? Do you ever wonder what your life would be like if you had been born into different circumstances? She asked impulsively. James was quiet for a long moment, and Elena worried she had overstepped some invisible boundary. Then he said, I think about it sometimes, but I try to focus on making the best of the circumstances I have. There's usually more possibility within our constraints than we realize at first, even when the constraints feel overwhelming. Especially then, James said gently, some of the most beautiful gardens I've seen were created in impossible conditions. Poor soil, harsh climate, limited resources. Sometimes constraints force us to be more creative, to find solutions we never would have discovered otherwise. Elena wondered if he was still talking about gardening, or if he sensed the deeper question behind her words. Either way, his answer offered a perspective she hadn't considered. Instead of seeing her royal duties as a prison, perhaps she could find ways to create something meaningful within those limitations. The roses you moved today, she said. Will they be happy in their new location? They'll be healthier, James replied. Whether that translates to happiness is a philosophical question I'm not qualified to answer. Elena smiled at that. Do you think plants can be happy? I think they can thrive or struggle, adapt or fail to adapt. Maybe that's close enough to happiness for practical purposes. They stood in comfortable silence for a few minutes, looking over the moonlit garden. Elena felt a peace she hadn't experienced in weeks, a sense of being exactly where she belonged. The feeling was both wonderful and terrifying because she knew it couldn't last. I should return to the castle, she said finally. It wouldn't do for anyone to discover the princess wandering the gardens at midnight. Of course, James said, though his voice held a note of regret that matched her own feelings. As Elena walked back toward the castle, she carried with her the memory of James's quiet wisdom about thriving within constraints. Perhaps there was a way to honor her duty to Valdoria while still preserving some space for the connections that made life meaningful. Perhaps she could find a way to be both a responsible princess and a woman capable of genuine feeling. The next morning brought news that would test that hope in ways Elena couldn't have imagined. The urgent knocking on Princess Elena's door came at dawn, far too early for normal court business. Elena awoke with the immediate alertness that years of royal training had instilled, knowing that pre-dawn summons usually meant crisis. Your Highness, her personal secretary, Marie, said breathlessly as Elena opened the door. The king requests your immediate presence in the council chamber. There's been news from the northern border. Elena dressed quickly in formal attire, her mind racing through possibilities. King Frederick of Nordmark had been making increasingly aggressive moves toward Valdoria's mineral-rich northern provinces. Intelligence reports suggested he was building military forces, but no one had expected him to act so soon. The council chamber was already full when Elena arrived, the air thick with tension and cigar smoke from an emergency session that had clearly been running for hours. King Raphael sat at the head of the table, his face grave. Queen Isabella was beside him, still in her nightgown and robe, her usual composure cracked with worry. Elena, her father said without preamble, Frederick has crossed the northern border. 3 villages are already under occupation, and his forces are advancing toward the copper mines. Elena felt the blood drain from her face. Valdoria's small army was well-trained, but vastly outnumbered by Nordmark's forces. Without strong allies, they wouldn't be able to hold the northern provinces for more than a few weeks. "What are our options?" she asked, taking her seat at the table. "Limited," admitted General Santos, the head of Valdoria's military. "We can mount a defense, but we need allies. Specifically, we need Duke Ferdinand's naval forces and his connection to the Astoria military alliance." Elena's heart sank as she understood the implication. Duke Ferdinand's marriage proposal wasn't just a political convenience anymore. It had become a military necessity. "Duke Ferdinand has already sent word," Queen Isabella said quietly. "He's prepared to mobilize his forces immediately to defend Valdoria, but only if the engagement is announced within the week. He wants to ensure his investment in our kingdom's security is protected by legal alliance." The room fell silent as everyone looked at Elena. She felt the weight of her entire kingdom's future pressing down on her shoulders. Her personal feelings, her growing attachment to James, her dreams of finding love, none of that mattered now. Valdoria needed Duke Ferdinand's military support, and marriage was the price of that alliance. "How long do we have before Frederick reaches the capital?" Elena asked, forcing her voice to remain steady. 3 weeks, perhaps 4 if we can slow his advance," General Santos replied. "But, Your Highness, even if we accept Duke Ferdinand's terms, it will take time to mobilize his forces and coordinate our defense." Elena closed her eyes briefly, seeing her future crystallize into certainty. When she opened them, she saw her parents watching her with expressions of sympathy and pride. They knew what this decision would cost her personally, but they also knew she would make the right choice for her people. "Send word to Duke Ferdinand," Elena said, her voice clear and firm. "Tell him I accept his proposal. We'll announce the engagement at tomorrow's emergency council meeting with the nobility." Queen Isabella reached across the table to squeeze Elena's hand. "I'm proud of you, dear one," she whispered. Elena nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Around the table, she could see relief on the faces of the council members. They had their alliance, their military support, their hope for protecting Valdoria's independence. All it had cost was her chance at love. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of military planning and diplomatic communications. Elena participated in strategic discussions with the same focused intelligence she brought to all her royal duties. But part of her mind kept drifting to the gardens below, where James was probably beginning his daily work among the roses they had saved together. By afternoon, word of the engagement had spread throughout the castle. Congratulations poured in from nobility, diplomatic messages arrived from allied kingdoms, and preparations began for the formal announcement ceremony. Elena accepted it all with gracious dignity, playing her role as the dutiful princess who was delighted to marry for the good of her kingdom. It wasn't until late in the day that she realized she would have to tell James about the engagement before he heard it from someone else. The thought of seeing disappointment or hurt in his eyes made her feel physically sick, but she owed him the courtesy of hearing it directly from her. Elena found James in the herb garden, carefully transplanting seedlings that would grow into medicinal plants for the castle's infirmary. He worked with his usual focused attention, unaware of the political upheaval happening around him. For a moment, Elena allowed herself to watch him, memorizing the way he moved with quiet confidence among the plants he understood so well. "James," she said softly. He looked up with the smile that had become so familiar and precious to her. "Your Highness, I was hoping you might stop by today. The heritage roses are already showing signs of improvement in their new location." "That's wonderful," Elena said, though her voice sounded distant even to her own ears. "James, I need to tell you something important." Something in her tone made his smile fade. He straightened, giving her his complete attention. "There's been a development," Elena continued, forcing herself to meet his eyes. "Political circumstances have changed, and I I'm going to be married. The engagement will be announced tomorrow." James went very still. Elena watched as understanding and then carefully controlled disappointment crossed his features. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but steady. "I see. Duke Ferdinand, I assume." Elena nodded, surprised that he knew about the courtship negotiations. "It's a political alliance. Valdoria needs military support, and marriage is the price of that protection." "Of course," James said. "I understand how these things work in royal families." There was no accusation in his voice, no anger or bitterness, just quiet acceptance that somehow made Elena feel worse than any emotional outburst would have. She had expected him to fight for her, to argue against the engagement, to make her choice more difficult. Instead, he was making it easier by stepping aside with grace. "James," she began, not sure what she wanted to say. "Your Highness," he interrupted gently, "you don't owe me any explanations. We both knew this was how things would end. Did we?" Elena asked, her careful composure beginning to crack. "Because I didn't know. I didn't know that Frederick would invade, or that I would have to marry immediately, or that saying goodbye to you would feel like losing part of myself." James stepped closer, his face softening with concern. "Elena, don't," she said, hearing how her voice trembled. "Don't be kind to me right now. It will make this harder than it already is." "I'm sorry," James said simply. "I'm sorry that duty has to come at such a personal cost." Elena looked at him, really looked, tried to memorize every detail of his face, the way the afternoon light brought out gold flecks in his brown eyes, the gentle curve of his mouth, the hands that created beauty wherever they touched. In another life, in another world, she could have loved this man completely. "Will you stay to finish the garden restoration?" she asked. "If you want me to," James replied. "The work is important regardless of other circumstances." Elena wanted to say yes, wanted to keep him close for whatever time they had left. But she also knew that seeing him every day while preparing for marriage to another man would be its own form of torture. "Finish the heritage roses," she said finally. "Make sure they have everything they need to thrive." But after that, she couldn't finish the sentence. "After that, I'll find another project," James said quietly. "Somewhere far from Valdoria." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken feelings hanging between them like a physical presence. Elena wanted to step forward, to close the distance between them, to have one moment of honesty about what might have been. Instead, she stepped back, putting the invisible but impermeable barrier of royal protocol between them once again. "Thank you," she said formally, "for everything you've done for the garden. It will be beautiful for generations because of your work." "It was my honor, Your Highness," James replied with an equally formal bow. Elena turned and walked away before she could change her mind, before she could say something that would make an impossible situation even more complicated. Behind her, she heard James return to his work among the herb seedlings, continuing to create beauty even in the face of personal loss. That evening, Elena stood on her balcony overlooking the garden for what she knew would be one of the last times. Tomorrow, Duke Ferdinand would arrive for the formal engagement ceremony. Within a week, she would be legally bound to marry a man she didn't love, couldn't respect, and would never understand. Below in the garden, she could see the soft glow of James's work lamp as he continued the delicate task of establishing new plantings. Even now, even knowing their connection was ending, he was thinking about the garden's future, ensuring that the plants would thrive long after he was gone. Elena pressed her hand against the cool glass of her balcony door and allowed herself to cry for the first time since childhood. She cried for the love she was giving up, for the life she would never live, for the woman she might have become if circumstances had been different. But mostly, she cried for the man in the garden below, who understood beauty and growth and nurturing, and who would disappear from her life as suddenly as he had entered it. The next morning brought Duke Ferdinand's arrival and the formal engagement ceremony. Elena wore her grandmother's emerald tiara and her most regal gown, playing the role of the happy bride-to-be with practiced perfection. Duke Ferdinand presented her with a massive diamond ring that felt heavy and cold on her finger, speaking eloquently about their future together while his eyes calculated the political advantages of their union. Through it all, Elena smiled and accepted congratulations with gracious dignity. But her heart remained in the garden, where a landscape consultant was carefully tending plants that would bloom long after both their hearts had been broken by the demands of duty. 2 weeks after the engagement announcement, Princess Elena had perfected the art of sleepwalking through her own life. She attended wedding planning meetings with Duke Ferdinand's representatives, smiled during dress fittings, and approved menu selections for the reception that would celebrate her sacrifice to political necessity. Through it all, she maintained the serene composure expected of a royal bride, while inside she felt increasingly hollow. The war news provided a convenient distraction from personal heartache. Duke Ferdinand's naval forces had successfully blocked Frederick's supply lines, while Astoria's military alliance had sent ground troops to reinforce Valdoria's northern defenses. The immediate crisis was contained, but everyone knew the conflict was far from over. "You've been doing wonderfully, dear," Queen Isabella said as they reviewed wedding invitations in the morning room. "I know this isn't easy, but you're handling everything with such grace." Elena nodded absently, her attention drawn to the garden visible through the tall windows. James had been working longer hours lately, rushing to complete the restoration before his departure. She had managed to avoid him completely since their conversation in the herb garden, but she was always aware of his presence, always conscious of the countdown to his leaving. "Mother," Elena said impulsively, "what was it like when you first married Father? Did you love him right away?" Queen Isabella set down her pen and studied her daughter's face carefully. "Your father and I had met several times during diplomatic visits, so we weren't complete strangers. But love? No, dear one. Love came gradually, built on respect and shared purpose." "How long did it take?" "Years," Queen Isabella admitted. "But, Elena, you must understand, your father and I were both willing to build something together. We shared similar values and goals. Love grew from that foundation." Elena heard the gentle warning in her mother's words. Duke Ferdinand had made it clear that he saw their marriage primarily as a business arrangement. He had spoken often about the benefits their union would bring to both their kingdoms, but never about building a partnership or even getting to know Elena as a person. "What if it doesn't grow?" Elena asked quietly. "What if respect and shared purpose aren't enough?" Queen Isabella reached across the table to take Elena's hand. "Then you find meaning in other things. Your duty to your people, your role in preserving Valdoria's independence, perhaps eventually your children. A meaningful life doesn't require romantic love, even though fairy tales would have us believe otherwise." Elena wanted to believe that was true, but everything in her rebelled against the idea of a loveless marriage. She had tasted the possibility of genuine connection with James, felt what it was like to have someone understand her thoughts before she fully expressed them. Going from that to a lifetime of polite conversation with Duke Ferdinand felt like a death sentence. That afternoon, Elena found herself drawn once again to the garden windows. James was working near the fountain, installing the last of the new irrigation systems. His work was nearly finished. Another few days, perhaps a week, and he would pack his tools and leave Valdoria forever. The thought struck Elena with unexpected panic. Once James left, this chapter of her life would close permanently. She would become Duke Ferdinand's wife, then eventually Queen of Valdoria, and the woman who had knelt in the dirt to learn about heritage roses would be buried beneath years of diplomatic protocol and loveless marriage. Without conscious decision, Elena found herself walking toward the garden. She told herself she was simply checking on the progress of the restoration, fulfilling her role as the royal family member responsible for palace improvements. But her heart was racing as she approached the fountain where James was working. "Your Highness," James said, looking up with surprise and what might have been pleasure. "I didn't expect to see you here. I wanted to see how the work was progressing," Elena said, amazed at how normal her voice sounded. "When do you expect to finish?" 3 more days should complete everything, James replied. The new irrigation system is installed, the heritage roses are established in their new locations, and I prepared detailed care instructions for the gardening staff. Elena nodded, fighting an irrational urge to ask him to work more slowly, to find reasons to extend the project indefinitely. And then, I have a position waiting in Scotland. There's an estate there with extensive gardens that need restoration after a fire. It should be interesting work. Scotland, as far from Valdoria as he could reasonably get. Elena wondered if the distance was intentional, if James felt the same need for geographical separation that she was beginning to understand. James, she said impulsively, then stopped, not sure what she had intended to say. He looked at her with those patient brown eyes that had become so dear to her, waiting for her to continue. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the garden, and Elena was suddenly overwhelmed by the finality of this moment. Soon, very soon, she would never see him again. I need to tell you something, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Before you leave, before I marry Ferdinand, I need you to know that these weeks with you have been the happiest of my life. Not because of the garden, although that's been wonderful, but because of you, because of the way you see the world, the way you've helped me see myself differently. James went very still. Elena, let me finish, she said urgently. I know it doesn't change anything. I know we both have to do our duty, follow the paths that have been chosen for us. But I couldn't let you leave without knowing that what we've shared mattered to me. That you matter to me. The words hung between them, like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Elena had violated every rule of royal protocol, acknowledged feelings that could only bring pain, said things that made their separation infinitely more difficult. But she couldn't regret the honesty, even knowing it would haunt both of them. Elena, James said again, and this time his voice was rough with emotion. You have to know that meeting you has changed everything for me too. Before I came to Valdoria, I thought I understood what I wanted from life. Simple things, meaningful work, financial security, maybe eventually a quiet marriage with someone who shared my interests. He moved closer, and Elena felt her heart stop. But knowing you, he continued, seeing your intelligence, your compassion, your strength, it showed me what love could be, what partnership could be. And now I have to live with knowing what I'm giving up, just as you do. Elena felt tears threatening and fought them back. This was not the time to break down, not when James was being so brave about an impossible situation. I'm sorry, she said. I'm sorry I've made this harder for both of us. Don't be sorry, James said firmly. Don't ever be sorry for being honest about your feelings. The world has enough polite lies. They stood looking at each other in the fading afternoon light, both aware that this was goodbye, that there would be no more stolen moments in the garden, no more conversations about heritage roses and soil composition. Tomorrow, Elena would return to wedding preparations and royal duties, while James would pack his tools and begin planning his departure. Will you be happy? Elena asked suddenly. In Scotland, working on the fire-damaged estate. James considered the question seriously, as he considered everything. I'll be useful, he said finally. I'll create something beautiful from something broken. That's not the same as happiness, but it's enough. Elena wanted to argue that it wasn't enough, that everyone deserved love and genuine joy, not just useful work. But she understood what he meant. They would both build meaningful lives within the constraints they had been given, find satisfaction in duty and accomplishment even if deep happiness remained elusive. The roses you moved, she said, changing the subject to something safer. Will I be able to see them bloom next spring? If they're properly cared for, yes, James said, his voice growing warm with professional pride. They should be spectacular. Your great-grandmother chose varieties that are both beautiful and resilient, rather like her great-granddaughter, I think. Elena smiled despite the ache in her chest. Trust James to find a way to compliment her while staying within the bounds of propriety. Even now, even in this moment of painful honesty, he was protecting her reputation and his own position. I should go, Elena said, though every instinct screamed at her to stay, to stretch out these last few minutes together. The Duke is expected for dinner, and I need to prepare. Of course, James said with a slight bow. Your Highness. Elena turned to go, then stopped and looked back at him one more time. James? Thank you. For everything. He nodded, his eyes holding all the words they couldn't say. Take care of yourself, Elena. Elena walked back to the castle with tears streaming down her face, not caring who might see them. She had said what needed to be said, acknowledged what needed to be acknowledged. Now, she had to find the strength to live with the consequences of honesty. That evening's dinner with Duke Ferdinand was a special kind of torture. He spoke enthusiastically about their honeymoon plans, a tour of his various properties and business holdings, while Elena smiled and nodded at appropriate intervals. When he mentioned his intention to modernize Valdoria's agricultural practices for greater efficiency, Elena found herself thinking about James's careful attention to preserving heritage varieties alongside new innovations. You're quite tonight, my dear, Duke Ferdinand observed as the servants cleared the dessert course. I hope you're not having pre-wedding nerves. Just tired, Elena replied. It's been a busy day. Well, soon enough you won't need to worry about such things, Ferdinand said with satisfaction. Once we're married, I'll handle all the important decisions. You can focus on more suitable activities, charity work, social events, perhaps redecorating the palace to reflect our combined households. Elena forced herself to nod pleasantly while privately wanting to scream. The idea of spending her life as an ornamental appendage to Ferdinand's ego was almost unbearable. She thought of James's respect for her intelligence, the way he had listened to her questions about garden management as if her opinions mattered. 3 days later, Elena stood at her bedroom window watching James pack his equipment into a small truck in the courtyard below. His work was finished. The heritage roses transplanted, the irrigation system installed, the garden restored to health and beauty. He moved with quiet efficiency, loading his tools with the same careful attention he brought to everything. Elena had avoided the garden for those 3 days, telling herself it was better to make a clean break, to not prolong the agony of separation. But now, watching him prepare to leave forever, she regretted not spending those final days learning everything she could about the plants he had restored, the systems he had created to ensure their continued health. As James closed the tailgate of his truck and walked toward the driver's seat, Elena felt a moment of pure panic. This was really happening. He was really leaving, and she would really spend the rest of her life married to Duke Ferdinand, never again experiencing the joy of genuine intellectual and emotional connection. Without thinking, Elena ran from her room through the castle corridors and out into the courtyard. James was starting the engine when she appeared, slightly breathless and completely heedless of royal dignity. Wait, she called. James turned off the engine and got out of the truck, his face showing surprise and concern. Is everything all right? Elena realized she had no plan, no good reason for stopping him beyond the desperate need to delay the inevitable. I wanted to make sure you had everything you needed for your journey, she said lamely. I do. Thank you, James replied gently. He studied her face with the same careful attention he gave to struggling plants. Elena, are you sure you're all right? Elena looked at him standing beside his truck, ready to drive out of her life forever, and felt something inside her break open. All her careful control, all her dutiful acceptance of fate, all her determination to do the right thing regardless of personal cost, it crumbled in the face of actually losing him. No, she said quietly, I'm not all right, and I won't be all right. But that's not your responsibility to fix. James moved closer, his voice gentle with understanding. I know this is hard. Believe me, leaving you is the hardest thing I've ever done. But we both knew this day would come. Did we? Elena asked, her voice breaking slightly. Or did we just accept it because everyone told us we had to? The question hung in the air between them, dangerous and subversive. James looked at her with something like wonder in his eyes, as if he was seeing her clearly for the first time. Elena, he said slowly, What are you really asking me? Elena took a deep breath, knowing she was about to cross a line from which there would be no return. I'm asking if you believe that duty always has to win. If love never gets to fight for itself. If two people who could make each other happy should really sacrifice that happiness for the sake of political alliances and social expectations. James stared at her for a long moment, and Elena could see him wrestling with the same questions that had been tormenting her. Finally, he spoke. I think, he said carefully, that sometimes the greatest duty is to be honest about what we really want and brave enough to fight for it. Elena felt her heart stop and restart. What do we really want, James? We want to build a life together, he said simply. We want to create something beautiful and meaningful the way we work together in the garden. We want to love each other without apology or shame. Elena looked at this man who saw her clearly, who valued her mind as much as her position, who could be happy spending his life creating beauty alongside her. Then she thought of Duke Ferdinand, of her parents' expectations, of Valdoria's political needs, and her duty as a princess. If I choose love, she said slowly, I lose everything else. My family, my kingdom, my purpose. Maybe, James said, or maybe you find a new purpose, a different way to make a meaningful contribution to the world. Elena, I would never ask you to give up your responsibilities lightly. But I also can't drive away without asking you to consider whether there might be another path. Elena felt as if she was standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down into an unknown future that was both terrifying and exhilarating. Everything she had been taught about duty and sacrifice warred with the growing certainty that walking away from James would be the greatest mistake of her life. If I choose you, she said, if I choose love, what happens to Valdoria? What happens to the alliance with Ferdinand that's protecting our people? I don't know, James admitted, but I know that a kingdom built on forced marriage and political coercion isn't sustainable in the long run. Maybe there's a different way to protect your people, a path that doesn't require you to sacrifice your happiness. Elena closed her eyes, thinking of her parents, of the generations of royalty who had put duty before personal desire, of the expectations that had shaped her entire life. Then she thought of the woman she had become in the garden with James, curious and engaged and alive in ways she had never experienced before. When she opened her eyes, James was watching her with patient love, ready to accept whatever decision she made. James, she said, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks, I choose love. I choose you. I choose the possibility of building something beautiful together, even if it means giving up everything I've known. The smile that spread across James's face was worth every risk she was taking. He stepped forward and took her hands, his own trembling slightly with emotion. Are you sure? He asked. Really sure? Because once we leave here together, there's no going back to the life you've always known. Elena thought of Duke Ferdinand, of her parents' disappointment, of the political chaos her decision would create. Then she thought of heritage roses that had been moved to new soil and were thriving, of systems that could adapt and grow when given proper care. I'm sure, she said firmly. But, James, I need to do this right. I can't just disappear. That would create a crisis that could hurt Valdoria worse than my marriage to Ferdinand helps it. Give me 24 hours to speak with my parents, to try to find a solution that protects my people while still allowing us to choose our own future. James nodded, understanding immediately. I'll wait. However long it takes, whatever you need to do to leave with honor, I'll wait. Elena felt a surge of love for this man who understood that she couldn't abandon her responsibilities, even while choosing a different path. Together, they would find a way to build a life that honored both love and duty, that created beauty without destroying the foundations that had shaped them. 24 hours later, Princess Elena stood in the same courtyard with a single suitcase and a letter of abdication that would shock the kingdom. She had spent the night in intense negotiations with her parents, working out a solution that would allow her younger brother Prince Miguel to inherit the throne while maintaining the alliance with Duke Ferdinand through trade agreements rather than marriage. It hadn't been easy. There had been tears, arguments, and moments when Elena thought she might lose her nerve. But in the end, her parents had seen the determination in her eyes and understood that their daughter had found something worth fighting for. "Are you ready?" James asked as he loaded her suitcase into the truck. Elena looked back at the castle that had been her home for 26 years, at the garden where they had fallen in love among heritage roses and irrigation systems. Then she looked at James, at the man who had taught her that love and growth required proper conditions and careful tending. "I'm ready," she said. "Let's go build something beautiful together." As they drove away from Valdoria toward an uncertain but chosen future, Elena felt something she had never experienced before, the wild joy of a woman who had dared to fight for love and won. Behind them, the heritage roses they had planted together were already putting down new roots, adapting to their relocated conditions and preparing to bloom more beautifully than ever before.